The radio operator's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the dial, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the vacuum tubes. It was just after midnight on a winter evening in 1944, somewhere along the crumbling German defensive line in northern Italy. The young soldier, no more than 20 years old, had been tasked with a routine scan of American radio frequencies, a daily ritual that rarely yielded anything of tactical value. The Americans were typically careful with their communications, maintaining strict radio discipline and using encryption protocols that frustrated German intelligence efforts. But tonight, something was different. The operator paused, his finger hovering over the dial as a clear voice suddenly emerged from the static, speaking in unaccented English about supply movements, troop rotations, and artillery positions. The transmission was not encrypted, yet it was coming from a distance that should have been well beyond the range of any field radio in the American arsenal. According to German intelligence assessments, American SCR-300 backpack radios could transmit only a few miles, and vehicle-mounted SCR-508 sets had a maximum range of 15 miles in optimal conditions. This transmission, however, was originating from at least 60 miles away, the voice as clear as if the American operator were sitting in the next room. It was the first in a series of anomalies that would cascade through the German command structure, creating ripples of uncertainty that would ultimately contribute to a catastrophic collapse of both tactical awareness and strategic confidence. The incident would never appear in official histories of the war, buried beneath the weight of battles and campaigns that seemed more significant to post-war chroniclers. Yet in this small moment, this seemingly trivial technological impossibility lay the seeds of a psychological operation that would help undermine the German military's faith in their own intelligence assessments and their understanding of the enemy they faced. The German radio operator reported his strange discovery to his superiors, who initially dismissed it as an error in calculating the transmission's point of origin. Perhaps it had been relayed from a closer position, they suggested, or maybe atmospheric conditions had temporarily enhanced the signal's range. These were rational explanations, consistent with the Germans' understanding of radio technology and the limitations of American equipment. But over the following weeks, similar reports began to accumulate from intercept stations across the Italian front. American radio transmissions were being received at distances that defied the technical specifications German intelligence had compiled. Some communications were being picked up more than 100 miles from their apparent source, with a clarity that should have been technically impossible. German signals intelligence officers, known for their methodical approach and technical expertise, began to question their previous assessments. Had they fundamentally misunderstood American capabilities? Was there some new technology at work, something that had somehow escaped their notice despite years of careful intelligence gathering? These questions, innocent enough in isolation, began to feed a growing sense of unease about what else German intelligence might have missed or misunderstood about Allied technological capabilities. What the Germans did not know, what they could not have known, was that they were witnessing not a technological breakthrough, but a carefully orchestrated deception. The Americans had not suddenly developed super-powered radio transmitters. Instead, they had deployed a network of relay stations and signal amplifiers that created the illusion of single transmissions coming from impossible distances. In some cases, they had positioned radio operators far behind enemy lines, taking advantage of the fluid nature of the front in mountainous terrain. In others, they had set up powerful transmitters that simply broadcast pre-recorded messages designed to sound like tactical communications. It was all part of a psychological operation conceived by the Joint Security Control, a secretive American organization responsible for strategic deception, working in concert with the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA. The operation had a specific objective: to create uncertainty about American technological capabilities, to make the Germans waste resources trying to understand a non-existent technology, and ultimately to make them doubt the reliability of their own intelligence assessments. It was a subtle form of psychological warfare, one that targeted not the morale of the average soldier, but the confidence of the German command structure in its ability to accurately assess the battlefield situation. The impact of this deception rippled through the German military hierarchy. Field commanders began to include caveats in their situation reports, noting the uncertainty about American communication capabilities. Intelligence officers devoted increasing time and resources to analyzing intercepted transmissions, looking for clues about this apparent technological advancement. Technical experts were consulted, Theories were proposed and debated, and eventually reports made their way to the highest levels of the Wehrmacht. By early 1945, the German High Command was operating under the assumption that the Americans possessed field radio technology far superior to their own, capable of reliable long-distance communication without the need for complex relay systems or fixed infrastructure. This belief influenced tactical decisions, leading German commanders to assume that American units had better coordination and faster response times than was actually the case. It contributed to a general overestimation of American capabilities that affected everything from defensive positioning to counterattack planning. The real genius of the deception lay in its exploitation of a fundamental aspect of human psychology, the tendency to extrapolate from limited information and to construct narratives that make sense of anomalous data. The Germans observed a phenomenon they could not explain within their existing understanding of American technology. Rather than questioning whether the phenomenon itself might be an illusion, they adjusted their entire model of American capabilities. This cognitive bias, known today as the representative heuristic, led them to draw broad conclusions from limited examples, assuming that the few instances of apparently long-range transmissions represented a general American capability. The deception worked precisely because it played upon this predictable pattern of human reasoning. It did not require the Germans to believe something entirely implausible. It merely required them to accept a logical-seeming but incorrect explanation for what they were observing. The story of the long-range radio deception illustrates a crucial aspect of psychological warfare that is often overlooked in popular accounts of military deception. The most effective operations are not those that create entirely false narratives, but those that cause the target to misinterpret real events. The Germans were not being fed completely fabricated information. They were actually intercepting American radio transmissions. The deception lay in creating circumstances that led them to draw incorrect conclusions about what those transmissions signified. This approach is far more subtle and ultimately more effective than outright fabrication, because the target's own observations seem to confirm the deceptive narrative. They become convinced not because they have been told something, but because they believe they have discovered it themselves. There is no more powerful form of deception than one in which the target becomes an unwitting accomplice in their own misleading. The radio deception had ramifications beyond immediate tactical considerations. It contributed to a growing sense among German military leaders that they were facing an enemy with technological resources that far outstripped their own. This perception was not entirely inaccurate. By 1944, American industrial capacity was indeed producing weapons systems at a rate and quality that Germany could not match. But the radio deception magnified this reality, creating an almost mythical aura around American technical capabilities. German officers began to attribute to American ingenuity what were often simply the advantages of material abundance. They imagined sophisticated technological solutions, where the Americans were often employing straightforward approaches, backed by overwhelming resources. This misperception had a subtle but significant psychological impact, contributing to a fatalism among some German commanders who came to believe that they were fighting not just a materially superior force, but one with almost magical technical advantages. The deception also had a secondary effect that its American planners had not fully anticipated. As German signal intelligence officers became increasingly focused on understanding the apparently advanced American radio technology, they devoted less attention to other, more conventional aspects of signals intelligence. Resources that might have been used to break American encryption systems or to track genuine tactical communications were instead directed towards solving the puzzle of the impossible radio ranges. This diversion of analytical talent and technical resources represented a significant intelligence opportunity cost for the German military, one that further degraded their already diminishing ability to understand the battlefield situation they faced. Consider the experience of a German intelligence officer tasked with assessing American capabilities and intentions in early 1945. He has reports on his desk describing radio transmissions that defy technical explanation. He has accounts from multiple reliable sources confirming the phenomenon. He has technical analyses that rule out conventional explanations. What conclusion should he draw? If he dismisses the reports as errors or deceptions, he risks underestimating enemy capabilities, perhaps catastrophically. If he accepts them at face value, he must revise his entire understanding of American technical sophistication. The psychological pressure in such a situation is immense, particularly in a military culture that prizes certainty and decisive action. The natural tendency is to err on the side of caution, to assume that the enemy is more capable rather than less. But this cautious approach plays directly into the hands of the deception planners, leading to exactly the overestimation they sought to create. The long-range radio deception was not an isolated operation, but part of a broader tapestry of psychological and deception warfare conducted by the Allies. It operated alongside more famous deceptions like Operation Fortitude, which convinced the Germans that the Normandy landings were merely a diversion from a main attack at the Pas de Calais, and the phantom army of inflatable tanks and dummy landing craft assembled by the American Ghost Army, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. What united these diverse operations was a sophisticated understanding of how military organizations process information and make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. The deception planners recognized that their target was not simply a collection of individual minds, but an institutional intelligence system with its own procedures, biases, and vulnerabilities. By introducing specific types of anomalous information into this system, they could influence its outputs in predictable ways, shaping the decisions made by commanders who relied on its assessments. The radio deception had a particularly powerful impact because it exploited the German military's respect for and reliance on technical expertise. The Wehrmacht was a product of German industrial and scientific culture, with its emphasis on precision, methodical analysis, and technical education. German officers were accustomed to receiving detailed, authoritative assessments from specialist technical branches, whose expertise was rarely questioned. When signals intelligence experts reported the existence of American radios with extraordinary capabilities, their assessment carried an institutional weight that made it difficult to dismiss, even when it conflicted with other intelligence or common sense. The deception thus leveraged the German military's own organizational culture against it, turning a strength, respect for technical expertise, into a vulnerability that could be exploited. The story of the long-range radio deception also illustrates how psychological warfare operations often target not just what the enemy thinks, but how they think. The goal was not simply to make the Germans believe a specific falsehood about American radio technology. It was to introduce a kind of epistemic uncertainty, a doubt about their ability to accurately assess American capabilities in general. Once this doubt was established, it could spread like a virus through the German intelligence system, infecting assessments of other American technologies and capabilities. If the Americans had radios that defied German technical understanding, what else might they have? This question, once raised, could never be fully answered, creating a persistent uncertainty that eroded confidence and degraded decision-making. As the war in Europe approached its final months, the cumulative effect of deceptions like the long-range radio operation contributed to a kind of cognitive collapse within the German high command. Faced with conflicting information, apparent technological surprises, and the overwhelming material superiority of the Allied forces, many German leaders retreated into fantasy and denial. Hitler himself became increasingly detached from reality, issuing orders to armies that existed only on maps and planning counteroffensives with forces that had been destroyed weeks earlier. While this disconnect can be attributed primarily to the deteriorating military situation, psychological operations played a role in accelerating and deepening the disconnection between German leadership perceptions and battlefield reality. The ultimate irony of the long-range radio deception was that it worked in part because the Germans attributed to the Americans a technological sophistication that did not, in fact, exist. American radio technology in World War II, while robust and produced in tremendous quantities, was not fundamentally different from or superior to German equipment. The Americans had no secret breakthrough, no revolutionary advance in radio transmission. What they had instead was a sophisticated understanding of how to create the illusion of such an advance, and how that illusion would affect German perceptions and decision-making. In a very real sense, the power of American psychological warfare lay not in making the Germans believe American lies, but in making them disbelieve their own truths. By undermining German confidence in their ability to accurately assess American capabilities, the deception planners achieved something far more valuable than any tactical surprise. They instilled a persistent doubt that colored all German intelligence assessments and strategic planning. The lessons of the long-range radio deception extend far beyond its immediate historical context. They speak to the fundamental relationship between information, perception, and decision-making in any competitive environment. The operation succeeded not because it presented the Germans with a completely false picture of reality, but because it introduced specific distortions that triggered predictable cognitive and institutional responses. This approach to deception, targeting not just what the adversary knows but how they process and interpret information, represents a sophistication in psychological warfare that remains relevant in today's information-saturated battle spaces. The digital age has only amplified the potential for such deceptions. Modern military organizations face a deluge of sensor data, signals intelligence, and open-source information that must be filtered, analyzed, and synthesized into coherent assessments. The sheer volume of this information creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited through carefully crafted deceptions. By introducing specific anomalies into this information environment, anomalies designed to trigger particular institutional responses, contemporary psychological warfare operations can achieve effects similar to those of the World War II radio deception, but on a much larger scale and with greater speed. The fundamental human and organizational cognitive biases that were exploited in 1944 remain largely unchanged, even as the technological context has evolved dramatically. The radio deception also illustrates the asymmetric nature of psychological warfare. The resources required to create the illusion of advanced radio technology were minimal compared to the impact on German intelligence operations and decision-making. A handful of strategically placed transmitters and a few carefully crafted false communications tied up significant German analytical resources and influenced strategic perceptions. This asymmetry makes psychological warfare particularly attractive to forces facing a materially superior adversary, as it offers the possibility of effects disproportionate to the resources invested. It is no coincidence that some of the most innovative psychological operations in military history have come from forces operating at a material disadvantage, seeking to level the playing field by targeting the adversary's perceptions and decision-making processes. For the German radio operators who first detected those impossibly clear, impossibly distant American transmissions, the war was already taking on an almost supernatural quality. They were witnessing the collapse of their world, both literally as Allied bombs reduced German cities to rubble, and figuratively as the ideology and leadership that had promised them victory led them instead to catastrophic defeat. In this context, the discovery of American radios that seemed to defy the laws of physics as they understood them was not just a technical curiosity, but a kind of cognitive breaking point. It represented the moment when the enemy became not just a superior force but an almost magical one, possessed of powers that could not be understood within the framework of normal German experience. This psychological breaking point, multiplied across countless similar moments of realization throughout the German military, contributed to the rapid collapse of organized resistance in the final months of the war. The American radio operators, meanwhile, went about their work largely unaware of the psychological impact they were having. Most were simply following orders, transmitting from the locations they were assigned without understanding the broader deception of which they were a part. A few, particularly those OSS operatives who had been briefed on the operation's true purpose, might have appreciated the elegant simplicity of the deception. By creating the illusion of a technological advantage that did not exist, they were helping to shape German perceptions in ways that would save American lives. They were fighting a war not just of machines and men, but of minds and perceptions, a shadow conflict whose victories would never be marked by medals or monuments, but would nonetheless contribute significantly to the Allied triumph. Today, as we navigate an information environment increasingly characterized by deliberate manipulation and strategic deception, the story of the long-range radio deception offers a sobering reminder of our cognitive vulnerabilities. We, like those German radio operators, are susceptible to misinterpreting anomalous information in ways that conform to our existing fears and expectations. We too can be led to doubt our own assessments when confronted with phenomena that seem to defy our understanding. And in that doubt lies the opening for manipulation, a cognitive gap that allows deception to take root and flourish. The best defense against such manipulation is not just skepticism about specific claims, but awareness of our own cognitive biases and the ways they can be exploited. By understanding how we process information and make judgments under conditions of uncertainty, we can become more resistant to the kinds of psychological operations that have shaped conflicts from World War II to the present day. The German troops who discovered American radios with ranges that shouldn't exist were not simply witnessing a technical anomaly. They were experiencing a carefully crafted illusion designed to make them question their understanding of the enemy they faced. In that questioning lay the seeds of doubt that would help undermine German military effectiveness in the final stages of the war. The radios themselves were unremarkable. It was what they represented in the German imagination that gave them their power. And perhaps this is the ultimate lesson of psychological warfare, that the most powerful weapon in any conflict is not the technology itself, but what we believe about the technology and about those who wield it. In the shadowy realm where perception meets reality, the battle for the mind remains the most consequential front in any war. As we reflect on this largely forgotten episode of World War II, we might ask ourselves what modern equivalents of those impossible radios might exist in our own information environment, what anomalies we have observed and too quickly explained away, what impossible signals we have detected but failed to recognize as deceptions. The German radio operators who first heard those distant American transmissions did not know they were witnessing not a technological breakthrough, but a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Their error was not in hearing the signals, but in how they interpreted what they heard, in the assumptions they made about what the signals represented. In our own cacophonous information landscape, filled with signals competing for our attention, we would do well to remember their experience. For the most dangerous deceptions are not those that tell us what is false, but those that lead us to misinterpret what is true. The battle for perception continues, silent and invisible, but no less consequential today than when those phantom radio signals first breached the German lines, carrying not just words, but doubt, a doubt that would echo far beyond the moment of transmission, reverberating through the corridors of command, and ultimately contributing to the collapse of an empire that had once seemed invincible. Listen carefully. What impossible signals might you be hearing right now?